The introduction of a new owner can be a time of incredible optimism around a club. Just look at the swell around Newcastle or Chelsea's rampant spending. But on the flip side of it, it can also have devastating and long-lasting effects on the club itself. Look at Everton, just working its way through a 10-point deduction from the financial mismanagement of its previous owner. Then of course there's Manchester City. Even though those owners have been there for a while now, they've run up a rap sheet of over 100 charges that might undo or at least threaten the success they've had. But both of those situations look like a veritable paradise compared to what has happened to Reading and their once optimistic owner, Dai Yong. This is the story of an owner who helped guide a club from the edge of the Premier League to the edge of destruction.
Can we just say one more time, we want our Reading back.
We want our Reading back. We want our Reading back. We want our Reading back.
It's gotten so bad that the British government is passing legislation and citing Reading as an example of why they're passing the legislation to try and make sure this situation never happens again. Your quick history lesson is Reading was founded way back in 1871 and finally scrapped its way into the top flight of England for the first time in 2005. All told, Reading's been in the Premier League for 3 seasons over the past 15 years. And in 2017, Reading was on a tear. It was on the cusp of being able to get into the Premier League again, and that's when a new owner came swirling around. You see, Reading had been through 4 owners in the last 5 years at this point, which it sounds absurd, but it's true, and they were succeeding in spite of that. But you can understand the club and fan optimism when a very wealthy Chinese investor turned their eye onto Reading. You see, earlier in 2017, Dai Yong had attempted to buy Hull City for $130 million, but had failed the checks to be able to successfully buy the club. So then he shifted to Reading. Later in that year, Dai Yong and his sister completed a deal to buy 75% of Reading. And the reason for the high optimism wasn't that he was just any wealthy Chinese investor. This guy was worth $1 billion, an actual $1 billion. And his sister, Dai Zhu Li, was worth $1.2 billion. Those are estimations in the years before the purchase of Reading in 2017. Now, the Dai family's wealth was centered around the fact that they had been building underground shopping malls in former air raid shelters, which sounds like a Bond villain sort of thing. The apparent reason for building these underground shopping malls is that you are not beset by the same taxes and regulations as building above ground, which, while kind of genius, also seems to show a willingness to toe the line and bend the rules that we are definitely going to run into again later. As with these things, most of the time it took months for the deal to be negotiated until it finally went through the week of the playoff final in the championship. And I'm not just mentioning that for no reason. Reading was in the playoff final against Huddersfield at Wembley in 2017, the winner going to the Premier League. And considering Reading had just been in the Prem 4 years earlier and Huddersfield had never been there in their entire history, Reading was the favorite, and it looked like it was a sound investment from Dai Yong to help propel the club into their new Premier League era. The highest realm of optimism was that Dai Yong was going to become the next Roman Abramovich, somebody with an unlimited amount of money who would take over a non-traditional power and propel them to Premier League greatness. But it didn't happen. Penalty kicks happened, and Huddersfield won the penalty kicks 4-3 to go to the Premier League for the first time. And from that moment on, Reading has entered a downward slide that with fits and starts has ended dramatically this year. It started the very next season because Reading showed up in the championship, and after making it to the playoff while finishing 3rd, they finished 20th. The first full season of Dai Yong's ownership, they had 41 less points than the season before. In the following season, they'd get 20th again. This was in spite of what was rumored to be a huge amount of investment from Dai Yong himself, up to $200 million that were injected into the club. But in a story that's eerily similar to Everton's failed investment, that money was just not producing any results at all. And because Reading was busy wallowing at the bottom half of the championship, the amount of spending that Dai Yong was partaking in started to draw the watchful eye of the English Football League. By 2023, the pre-tax losses over the previous 5 years would hit £146 million, which is just slightly over the EFL requirement of just £13 million. The peak was in 2021 when these problems started to become apparent because Reading was spending 234% of its revenue on player wages alone. 234%. And it wasn't just financial issues. They also started to run into bouts of really poor man management that were honestly kind of hard to explain. For example, flaming the club captain on the club website from January 2022. This is a quote. Over the course course of the last few months, center back Liam Moore has spoken with manager Veljko Paunovic and directors of the club to state his clear desire to leave Reading Football Club and pursue his career elsewhere. Our club, together with its manager, is intent on selecting players in the first team squad who are dedicated to giving their absolute all to Reading Football Club. That starts with our captain. As a result, Moore will no longer be given the honor of our club captaincy. While it is certainly more eloquent than what you'd get from a Twitter troll, it's not exactly the sort of thing you want to be reading on a club website. The end result of running afoul of the EFL and their own players is that Reading was hit with transfer embargoes and a 6-point deduction in 2022 and 2023. And it was the 2023 point deduction that proved fatal for Reading. Last year, Reading was relegated, and if they hadn't had those 6 points deducted, they would have been safe. It sent them down to League One for the first time in 21 years after multiple spells in the Premier League. And as relegation so often does, it brought attention to an increasingly untenable situation at Reading. It was a pot of boiling water just waiting for something to boil over. And that happened almost immediately after relegation, when His Majesty's Revenue and Customs Service, hip hip cheerio lads, oh I say, colloquially known as the HMRC, issued a winding up petition over unpaid taxes. This is something that's issued by the HMRC if a debt has been ignored for more than 3 weeks. So, considering this was issued about 3 weeks after they got relegated, Dye essentially was ignoring the debt from the moment that Reading had been sent down. And when HMRC came calling, that was the catalytic moment for Reading fans. They started to organize. They actually formed a group called Sell Before We Die, which, fair play. From one enthusiast of wordplay to another, well done. When discussing why they formed, they said, despite his best intentions, Mr. Dye's stewardship has been an unmitigated disaster. Anytime somebody breaks out the word unmitigated, things are not going well. They went on to say, we are now calling for Mr. Dye to sell the club at the earliest opportunity. And it's hard to blame the fans for feeling this way. In 2017, they were staring at a likely promotion with a new billionaire owner at their back, and now they've gotten nothing but misery and embarrassment ever since. And it isn't just the men's team either. In 2023, the women's team from Reading FC was relegated from the Women's Super League, and the financial issues were so crippling, they had to take the team from full-time to part-time. The 16-year tenured head coach Kelly Chambers was let go, and this clear, consistent disintegration around Reading has left the question, who and what is to blame? And for a lot of people, the answer seems very clear, it's Dye Young. But I'm always hesitant when talking about these ridiculous sums of money to just go in full and blame the owner. I find it hard to blame someone for not spending hundreds of millions of dollars they're never going to see again just because people think that they should. I mean, it's clear that the issue for the club wasn't a lack of investment, it was honestly way too much. After all, Dye allegedly spent over $200 million, so what happened to it? Even the fan group calling for his ouster acknowledges that the failure has been despite his best intentions. The beloved former owner Sir John Medeski added, it hasn't been a success, obviously. I think he's had very bad advice, because quite frankly, for the investment he's put in, he's seen scant return. And the most obvious indication of bad decision making has been on the transfer market, particularly the lack of profitable sales of players. And the best example is looking at a player like Michael Olise. Everybody and their mother seemed to know that Michael Olise was going to be a good Premier League winger at some point while he was plying his trade on that Reading team that somehow managed to get up and finish 7th. And all they got for him was just over $9 million in a sale to Crystal Palace. Even at the time, Transfermarkt thought that that was low. Their estimated value for him was nearly double that. This was the same year that Jared Bowen was sold in a similar transfer to West Ham for over $21 million. And while that sale feels low, it's the only one in the top 10 Reading sales in history Day has been responsible for as the owner. In fact, the next one that Dye Young is responsible for is the 15th most expensive sale in the history of Reading, which was Leandro Bacuna for under $4 million. But there is another potential culprit outside of just terrible decision making and inability to maximize player value. And it could be the one that is contributing most outside of Day's own apathy to the financial shortcomings at Reading in recent years: China. Dye Young still lives in China. He still works in China. And the money that pays for Reading's accounts is transferred out of China every month, which the BBC clearly believes is not the best way of doing things. Much to my amusement, describing his monetary logistics, transferring money from China every month, as shambolic. And the reason it's quite so shambolic is right around the time that Dye Young bought Reading, China started to change its approach to allowing investors to funnel tons of money out of China. According to to this BBC article, China started to crack down on international spending because they believed that it was hurting the domestic economy. As a result, it just got harder and harder to move money around. As Professor Simon Chadwick told the BBC, the shutters started to come down in 2017-2018, right when Dai bought the club, and it became very difficult to move money around, particularly for unproductive assets. And all that's important to point out because in other videos I've made about bad owners, sometimes they just ran out of money, but what everybody seems to agree on is that Dai Yong still has plenty of money. After they bought the club together, his sister transferred full control of the family business and the club to him, as far as everybody understands. And based off their estimations of net worth over the past 10 years, that means Dai Yong is worth at least a couple $1 billion. There are estimates out there of Dai Yong's net worth that are over $20 billion. Obviously, that stuff is hard to calculate, but the company still exists and he's still the sole head of it. So what is definitely clear is that the issue isn't a lack of money, it's a lack of financial logistics, an ability to get the money to the right place at the right time and be able to pay off everything in an intelligent way. Essentially, it boils down to either Dai Yong is just a bad businessman or he doesn't care. And whatever the actual reason that all these bad things are happening, it's not necessarily the first time that they're happening. If you're a Reading fan, cover your ears, because this one might sound a little too familiar. But Dai Yong used to own another club, Beijing Renhe. It was relegated to the third tier of Chinese football in 2021, and it dissolved as a result of the financial strain that put on the club. Also, it just feels worth mentioning that the China Dilly Group, which is the parent company of Dai Yong's company, has been suspended from trading on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange since last year. The reason? Concerns around financial reporting. So it is clear at the very least that a lack of financial organization has plagued Dai Yong's past wherever he's been and has helped contribute to a death spiral for Reading. And that spiral's still going. Reading is currently in the relegation zone in League One at the moment. It's been such a resounding failure that the ownership of Dai Yong has been used as an example by the British government to try and clean up ownership situations so that quite literally this doesn't happen again. The government vowing to tackle inappropriate ownership, Dai Yong's ownership being classified as inappropriate. I made a whole video about the proposed changes the British government is laying down. You can check that out in the description. As for Reading, things are still getting worse. In September of this year, Dai Yong was charged by the English Football League for official misconduct. They had asked him to deposit the amount totaling 125% of the month's wages into an account, and he failed to do so by the deadline. The EFL recommended that he be suspended from all football activities for a year, but an independent commission fined him £20,000 with an extra £50,000 if he failed to deposit the right amounts into the account by January. Even though they laid down a lighter sentence, they did call it deliberate misconduct on the part of Dai. They came to that conclusion after his, and I quote, failure to provide detailed evidence as to the ongoing reasons for failure to pay. The EFL then went on to threaten further action if he continues to not meet the deadlines and requirements of the EFL. But we do arrive today at a light at the end of the tunnel, and that is that Dai Yong is looking to sell the club and end what has become an increasingly intense nightmare for Reading. It's a situation that nobody seems to be enjoying at all, and it's also a situation that hopefully the legislation the British government's trying to push through will make impossible in the future. All the links for the research in this video are down in the description, as well as the information for our researcher Isaiah, and if you enjoyed the video, please do subscribe. Also, if you want to keep binge watching videos, check this one out. We went to the Faroe Islands and spent a week there following the smallest European club ever. It is awesome. Very cool. Very fun. Lots of drone footage, flying around, wild stuff.